This podcast episode was made possible in part with support from Sacred Rights, a project funded by the Henry Luce Foundation and the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation and hosted by Northeastern University. Sacred Rights is a project that supports public scholarship on religion and provides resources and networks for scholars of religion committed to translating the significance of their research to a broader audience. I recommend you learn more about Sacred Rights on their website at sacred-rights.org or find Sacred Rights on Twitter at sacred_rights. Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. Since 2017, I have talked to professors, authors, teachers, journalists, practitioners, and scholars about all things related to religion. On this episode, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Tamisha Tyler to the show. Dr. Tamisha Tyler is a visiting assistant professor of theology and culture and theopoetics at Bethany Theological Seminary in Richmond, Indiana. Her research interests include theopoetics, theology and the arts, Afrofuturism, Black popular culture, and science fiction. Her dissertation, Articulating Sensibilities, Methodologies in Theopoetics in Conversation with Octavia E. Butler, explores Butler's work in the Parable series as an embodied, artistic, and theopoetic response to the theological, economic, and ecological upheaval in Butler's dystopic world. On this episode, we dive into her field of theopoetics and then discuss her academic interest in Octavia Butler. You can find Tamisha Tyler online at TamishaTyler.com. Thank you so much for listening. Dr. Tamisha Tyler, welcome to Classical Ideas.
Thank you for having me. It's such an honor to be here.
Would you mind spending a moment and introducing yourself a little bit to the audience so they know who you are and what you do?
Not at all. Hello, everyone listening. It's so great to be on this podcast. I'm very excited about this. My name is Dr. Tamisha Tyler. I currently serve as a visiting assistant professor of theology and culture and theopoetics at Bethany Theological Seminary in Richmond, Indiana. I am also an artist, so I'm a poet. I love working with artists. I'm a part of a really great artist collective in Los Angeles called Level Ground. We engage in decentered leadership, and we have just these amazing residencies. We also have a magazine that's created by all Black artists, and the artists actually own the magazine. So we just have some really great projects there. I also am involved in different things in academia, including feminist studies and religion. We have a great blog that we do, and I'm just an all-around nerd.
I love that. You are kind of involved in a lot of things, and it seems to me that just essentially remaining creative is almost like a major underlying focus for you. Does that resonate a little bit?
That resonates a lot. That's absolutely correct. I got into theology because I was an artist who was trying to find herself within the context of her faith. So I grew up with creativity and spirituality always being connected. I always tell my story in the sense that my mom was my first theologian and taught me about spirituality, even though we didn't go to church regularly. We weren't a church-going family. We were a very spiritual family. And so I learned a lot of that from my mom, but we're also a very creative family. Writing, all of my older brothers and sisters were lyricists, were hip hop artists. And so all of those ideas of creativity and spirituality was always interconnected. And it didn't feel separated until I got to college, where I was going to church regularly. And that caused a rift in me where I couldn't be my whole artist self in a church context. And so those questions of how to be fully me led me into my research. So yeah, creativity is definitely a cornerstone for me.
Tell me a little bit about some of the academic turning points, like along the way, because, you don't just get a PhD by accident. So tell me about some of those major turning points and maybe some important people along that academic path that kind of helped you find yourself as a scholar.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And Gregory, I'll tell you, I knew I was going to get a PhD I was the nerd who in high school was creating the boundaries of how I would start my own college, which is weird. And don't ask me why I thought about this, but I was like, I'm just going to start my own college. I'm going to lead this college and it's going to be great. I was a very weird child. Academically, I think for me, getting into theology was such a turning point. Starting out in obviously bachelor's, I was interested in writing. I was interested in African American literature. I ended up going to Cal State Long Beach, go Beach, and they didn't have an African American literature class. So I was taking an independent study degree, combining classes from Black studies and women's studies, or women's studies and English. And English wanted me to take British literature two. And I had just taken British literature one, and I read Beowulf. And I vowed to never read a piece of British literature ever again in my life. We argued for the whole term because I was like, I do not have to take this class. And in the meantime, I had a professor, I cannot remember his name. We were taking hip hop. It was a hip hop class. And he really helped us to understand the relationship between social justice and the music of the current generation in soul music. He
Cool.
started with soul music and then said, hip hop is this generation's soul.
Mm,
So, all of the questions that the young people in that time were asking through soul music, we were asking through hip hop. And so that's how he started. And it really helped me to solidify something I already knew, but I hadn't articulated, which is understanding these cultural artifacts, right? These pieces, these novels, these things that I love to both write and read were contextually rooted. And so after that class, I said, I'm not going to argue with the English department anymore. I'm going to be a Black Studies major because I don't want to take African American literature courses outside of the rootedness of the culture it's embedded in.
mm,
And that became, I think, my first turning piece academically, because it really helped me to think through the way in which these creative artifacts and these amazing things that I was studying and looking at and enjoying came from somewhere. And I knew that, but I needed to know that for my academic journey in a different way.
mm.
When I got to seminary, it was very quick. I said, oh, I'm going to go to seminary. A month later, I was in class. So everything was a turning point for me at that time. And I had questions about God, but again, I didn't know how to articulate the things that I already knew. And I was in a Gospels class with Tommy Givens, and that changed everything for me because it really helped me to understand and again situate the biblical text within a particular context. And not only its original context, but also to understand the implications of interpretation in my own context.
Mm.
And it really allowed me to ask different kinds of questions that I was never allowed to ask within a worship setting. And that really changed the game for me. Oh, I can ask these questions. Oh, there
Mm.
are these things. Oh, the implications of this are, and that helped me to kind of break out a bit of the expectations of particular church settings as it related to whether or not I could even ask questions. Also, Barry Taylor, got to give a shout out to Barry Taylor. And as my advisor would say, he will take you to the edge of the cliff of heresy, but he won't let you jump.
Mm.
And that allowed me to push boundaries in a way that I didn't know I had permission to.
Yeah.
So that was my first term in seminary. So that changed it, and it kind of rooted me and it freed me a little bit to go, oh, I can do this in the way that I feel like I should, that's already in my body. I just needed, not even permission is the wrong word. I needed to be shown an example of, I needed precedent maybe, and not permission. I needed precedent to go, this is something that actually happens.
But it's really interesting that you talked about asking questions in a religious setting as well, because I was talking to Corwin Davis recently,
Mhm.
and he was telling me about leadership structures in practical theology of bottom up versus top down,
Yeah.
and we were talking about the importance of community and what it means to be a person in a religious community who has a say. Do you know what I mean? Versus being dictated to,
Absolutely.
and how different those two things are. So I love that connection between what you just said and what Corwin said whenever I talk to him, because really it's a profound thing to feel like you have a say in a religious setting. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, shout out to Corbin. Brilliant, brilliant scholar. It does. It makes absolute sense. And I think part of the danger, especially as a professor and especially in theological education, is to reinforce that dictatorship. I think part of the journey for me was I was learning things, obviously. I was learning about the historical context, I was learning how to exegete, I was learning all these different things. But more importantly, I was in spaces that gave me permission to be myself. And I was
Mm,
in spaces that gave me permission to actually encourage me to ask difficult questions. I think that being an example and creating the spaces and the precedent for asking questions instills something into people that helps them when they go into their own ministries, their own working spaces, to create those safe spaces for other people. And I think it's
hmm
more than just, well, you got to ask some great questions in seminary. Now you're going to go and dictate to people for the rest of your life. It's like, no, 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 no. I'm giving you permission to ask questions and to help you navigate those questions so that you can learn to create those same spaces for other people. And I think that is what helps facilitate that bottom up, right? That you have a voice. I think a lot of
Yeah.
people who try to create dictatorships probably didn't have the chance to have a voice, weren't taught that that was a possibility. And so they
hmm
don't know how to create that world if they've never been a part of it.
Now, what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about your research. So, you did your dissertation. It's called Articulating Sensibilities, Methodologies in Theopoetics and Conversation with Octavia E. Butler.
Yeah.
So, I want to start just generally with your fascination with Octavia Butler's work. Tell me where she comes into your story, how you come to appreciate the work of Octavia Butler in general.
In 2016, when I started my doctoral program, I was interested in creating some kind of a spiritual care for artists, particularly for artists of color, and specifically for Black artists, ways that they can care for themselves or somebody can care for them as they were caring for others. That was my really broad idea. In September of 2016, J.R. Thomas was killed by police. It was the first week of my program.
Mm.
And we went into advocacy mode. I participated as head liturgist as part of a year-long liturgy as protests project where we did services in front of the police station for a year. I was a part of all these different things, and I said I couldn't do this dissertation if it wasn't connected to these elements of justice. So then it became arts, care for artists, artist stuff, justice, which again, always a part. I burnt out, as you do. And for the summer 2017, I said, I only have two assignments for the summer. I'm going to catch up on Game of Thrones, which is a whole nother story, and I'm going to only read fiction. Edna Trigg, who was a part of our Subversive Liturgy project, said, hey, they have this exhibit at the Huntington for Octavia Butler. You should check it out. Here's some tickets. Go and see it. And I said,
Mm.
okay. And I had read Butler. I read Kindred, I don't know, maybe it was high school or something, and I loved it. And then life happened, and I didn't read anything else by her. And I went to this exhibit, and it had not just copies of the novels, but it had copies of her notebooks,
Mm.
things that she had written, things that she said, I'm going to be a best-selling writer. I'm going to do this. All of her philosophies and encouragements and thoughts about life and things like that. And I just really resonated with her. And I said, why did I stop reading her?
Mm.
I'm gonna pick up, I'm gonna read something. I'm gonna start reading her again. And I'm in the exhibit hall and I look up and there's this huge poster advertising Parable of the Sower. And so I go, all right, I'll start there. I'm just like, oh yeah, I'll start. No clue what it's about. I'm just gonna start there. And I read Parable of the Sower. And I remember, and during this time, I was house hopping and just staying with friends and just kind of enjoying my time, no responsibilities really, and trying to get clarity on my dissertation. And one of the questions that came to me is, what are the artists doing? I said, well, that's a really simple, kind of stupid question. And I thought about it a little more and I said, oh, no, 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 no. In all of this crazy, social economic upheaval, environmental upheaval, all of these different things that are happening, racial discrimination, the history, all of this stuff. What are the artists doing? How are they responding to all of the things that's happening in our world? And I
Mm.
go, oh, that's the question. That's not only the question for my dissertation, that's the question for my career. Like
Mm.
that's the question that I want to create the world around academically. And then I read Parable of the Sower. And then I sit there in the living room of my friend's house as I'm house sitting with her and their dog. And I go, why is no one talking about this? Parable of the Sower is the answer to this question.
Mm.
It is Octavia Butler's response to everything that's happening in the world. And she uses religion as a way to navigate that. Why aren't we talking about this? So I
Mm.
was like, I'm going to write my paper for my next class on this book because it's so amazing, blah, blah, blah. And I go to AAR that year and I meet a Sean Crawley, who is a phenomenally brilliant artist and scholar and studies literature and all of that. And I shyly went up to him. He was standing in a lobby, and I'm like, Dr. Crawley, thank you for, I don't know, existing. I don't know what I said. And, and I told him about my paper. I wanted to write a paper on the theology of earthseed. I'm very interested in this. Like, do you have any like resources, advice? And he gave me the best piece of advice. He said, I don't know that anybody's really working on that on Octavia Butler and religion. And I go, huh? I go, oh, you mean like like a not just a paper. And then he just looks at me, goes, nice to meet you. And I was like, and then the light bulb went off. And
Yeah.
that was a turning point of, oh, there is something here. Like again, I knew there was something, but I couldn't fully articulate what the thing was.
Hmm.
And that sent me on a trajectory. And it was after then that I found out that the exhibit I went to was actually her archives because the Huntington Library has literally all of her archival research. And it was in Pasadena, it's down the street from me, because she was born and raised in Pasadena. And those
Mm.
are things I didn't know before I made that decision. I was like, Butler is it. And then I get home and I talk to my advisor, and he's like, oh, yeah, I can get you access to the archives. And it just kind of all fell into place. So then I was like, okay, Butler, okay, Octavia, me and you are going on a journey. And we're still there at the beginnings of that journey. And it's wonderful.
Mm. That is very cool. So you feel like you have a lot of work still yet to do, I'd imagine, in this field. I mean, if it's only been since 2016, 2017 when you got interested in this, I mean, there's a lot of untapped material here, isn't there?
Oh, yes. So the dissertation shifted because I was ABD, which is all the dissertation,
Hmm.
in 2020. So January 2020 is when I became ABD. And I thought, great, I'm going to spend the rest of my time in the archives working through all this. And then we all know what happened in March of
Yeah.
2020. So the archives were closed to me. And so the dissertation that I ended up writing was a shift focusing more on theopoetics, which I'm actually really grateful for because I didn't have access to the archives because Butler's work is not hadn't been digitized. It's still not. But and so I said, okay, let me write the dissertation, which is a dissertation, and then I can write the book that I actually want. And so
Very cool.
that's what I'm doing. Yeah.
I love that. Okay, so you bring up this term theopoetics. Theopoetics is something I have never mentioned on this show ever. Also, Octavia Butler is brand new to the episode list. So, what is theopoetics? What do people out there need to know about this field that you are involved in that they may not know?
Yeah. So I'm going to give you my definition and then I'm going to talk a little bit
Hmm.
about some of the history. So my definition of theopoetics is this. Theopoetics are the creative and embodied rhythms and practices that help us articulate sensibilities about the divine. And I'll say that
Hmm.
again. The creative and embodied rhythms and practices that help us articulate sensibilities about the divine. Now, that's my definition. There
Hmm.
are so many different theopoetic scholars and theopoets throughout the course of the field that have shaped theopoetics differently. So, someone like David Miller would say that theopoetics is the strategies of human signification that occur after ultimate loss of fixed meaning, meaning it kind of tied to like the death of God, radical theology. After God is dead and the bottom drops out and everything changes, what happens? How
Hmm.
do what are the strategies of human signification in that space? That's where theopoetics steps in. Other scholars will say theopoetics is the ways in which that we pay attention to our embodiment, we involve our community, where ties of justice, ties of all of these different things, and even more talk particularly about the way in which theopoetics is how we incorporate the arts into theology. I think that is more of a theology and the arts. The poetics of theopoetics is not poetry necessarily, it's poesis, which is meaning making. How do we make meaning of the world after basically, how do we make meaning of the world that we've inherited? And how do the arts, the creative, the embodied practices help us facilitate that meaning making? So that's how I would describe theopoetics. I would also say it's not in its own way, its own theology, as it were, but it's more of a modifier and a mode. So you'll find that it resonates with certain theologies, like womanist theology, which does a lot of embodiment and focuses on art and iconography and all these different things. But it probably will push back to something like a systematic or analytic theology and has very different questions. So it's not like, oh, it's definitely its own thing. It can be, but it's going to point you towards different practices and different questions, even within the tradition you're already a part of.
Okay, cool. All right, so let's tie these things together. Let's tie together religion. Let's tie together Octavia Butler. I was reading an interview that you did with a publication called Wrapped,
Mm-hmm.
where you said Butler gave you a wake-up call to the ways religion can and has been used for change. I'd love to hear your longer elaboration on how Butler uses religion in her work that really stand out to you.
Yeah. Butler does an interview with Democracy Now! I don't know, maybe a year or less right before her passing. And she's talking about religion.
I need to
And
listen to that. I love Democracy Now!
yeah, it's a great, it was one of it actually was released years later after her death, and it wasn't released previously.
Hmm.
So really great. I got to find the link and send it to you. But in that, she's talking about religion, and she says everybody has a religion, whether they call it a religion or not. And she, in her work, is shaping the way in which, and I don't think she says it distinctly in this interview, but there is a point where she says that religion has been utilized throughout history by humankind as a tool to evoke change in the world. Now, she doesn't say if it's a force for good or bad. She just says religion is a force that humankind has used throughout history to evoke change in the world. And Parable of the Sower, as she says in this Democracy Now! Interview, is the way that she shows how it can possibly go right and how it can possibly go wrong. When she is utilizing this, she's touching on all of the ways that religion has been utilized politically, how it affects economics, how it affects the notion of belief, everything from the everyday, day to day, how do I relate to people, all the way up to how is this concept of belief, for lack of better words, manipulated in a way to create the kinds of worlds that that person who's utilizing religion wants people to participate in. What's unique about, I don't want to say distinctly unique, but what is partly unique about Butler is the Parable of the Sower, particularly, is what we would call a cautionary tale.
Hmm.
So is if we continue within speculative fiction, if we continue on the route that we're in, this is the world that we will inherit. And Butler gets, in my opinion, way closer than some of the things we're closer to Handmaid's Tale, closer
Hmm.
to like Butler gets, I think, the closest to the world that we inherited. And what's really cool is that the journals for Parable of the Sower start in July of 2024.
Hmm. Yeah. When I read it, that really stuck out to me because I was reading it in 2020 and I was like, oh, wow, this starts in 2024. This is absolutely crazy that it's right now.
Yes. And so it's not just the way in which she depicts, company towns, the disparaging of rich and poor, the, political system, but the way in which she incorporates the religious into all of this, and the way in which belief and religion dictate the actions and the movements of what is happening in the world. I think that that is the unique contribution. And she doesn't sugarcoat it, right? It's the real world. She
Mm.
talks about how she couldn't write about anything that couldn't happen in this duology. And she gets way too close because she's paying attention. And I think that there is this sense of trigger, or this realness that you encounter that goes, oh man, that feels like right now, I feel like I'm in Lauren's world. I don't want to be in Lauren's world. So
Mm.
what do I do? But in her writing of giving us this dystopian, realist kind of world, and in most of her stuff, she never leaves you without hope. But it's a complicated hope. It's a kind of hope to where you're like, I'm glad that Lauren is doing the things that she does in this novel, but there are a couple of things that I would never do. I would never date that person. I would never do those things. And yet you're faced with a young Black girl in, a dystopian world who's trying to create hope for everyone else and is making choices and decisions for her survival that make you distinctly uncomfortable.
Mm.
And that's the point.
Yeah.
Like, hope isn't this, direct line in which everything is copacetic. Hope is rift with all of these decisions of survival and change that make you very uncomfortable.
Mm.
And I think that when we talk about hope, we don't necessarily deal with those things. And it doesn't take away from the power of hope. It actually, its rootedness are in decisions of survival and a decision to live in a world that is marked by death. And so I think Butler contributes by creating these pockets of realness in a fight for hope, in a fight for survival that checks us in a way to go, your idealized thoughts about hope may not be real, but that doesn't mean that hope isn't.
Mm.
Um, and I think that's one of the things I really love about her work.
Yeah, well, and you mentioned Lauren Oya Olamina,
Mhm.
the main character in the Parable books. You wrote an article about her,
Yes. Yes.
just about her, in the Feminist Studies in Religion journal in 2022, which I read yesterday and really enjoyed. And I'd love to hear your elaboration on, like, what is this piece about for the listeners? Like, I want everybody else to go read it, obviously, but what do you think people should know about Lauren's character and how she's a theologian of our times? You kind of alluded to this already, but I want you to promote your piece a little bit.
Yeah. So this is talking about the character Lauren and about how I believe that she is a theologian for her time. And some people go, but she's not. The first thing people usually go is, she's not Christian. And I go, well, yes, that's true. But if theology is the study of God, there are other religions that also have God and gods and spirits and things. And so she may not be a Christian theologian, but she definitely is an earth seed theologian.
Mm.
And broadening our conversation about what theology or conversations about God even is. But I think more importantly that Lauren offers us a way of thinking about who God is, thinking about our relationship with God, and thinking about the implications on our world. Lauren believes that God is change. And as a result, Earthseed, humankind, or the earth, right, is in partnership with God, right? God shapes the universe shapes God. So if we are shaping God, then we have a responsibility to shape God in a way that is for the life and the living and the hope of all beings. And it is from this, both the realness of God is change and that things may change on a dime, and that there is this dynamic that we need to learn how to adapt into. And we have this power and responsibility of partnership with God. Those things are directly implicated on how to live in connection to one another and in connection to the land. So when we are dealt with atrocities and disaster and calamity and all of these different things, the first thing we learn from Lawrence theologian is like, if God has changed, how do we learn to adapt? How
Mm-hmm.
do we learn to adapt and to change to the different things, right? If God has changed, then we have to be comfortable with change. But it's the kind of change that pushes towards life. And it is a kind of change that takes responsibility for the care of yourself and one another as you are adapting. And I think so much of how we engage theology is it can be a little passive. God is going to do this thing. We are going to sit back. And it's as if, even within our own tradition, Jesus didn't give us distinct directives
Mm.
of doing, right?
Yeah.
And so it's a sense of like, forgive my French. I'm trying to, not be, myself, but, get up off your ass and do something. You have been giving directives by the deity you think is God that created the universe. Why are you sitting there waiting for them to do the thing that they told you to do?
Mm.
And I think that there's resonance in the act or push towards action that Lauren gives us in conversation with Earthseed. And
Mm.
so, as we are dealing with a lot of the worlds that Lauren has grown up in, the world that we have right now is the world Lauren grew up in. She knows how to adapt, and
Mm.
she knows how to fight for hope and for a religion that fights for hope. So, why wouldn't we listen to her for our time?
Man, I got to go read this book again. I need to go and start it back over. I haven't read it in 4 years, and now I'm like, oh my gosh, I have to go back and reread this immediately. I'm gonna have to see if my library has it for my Kindle because
Please, actually, it
I
may
want to
even
redo it.
be available on, I hate to, promote a big conglomerate, but if you look at if you have a Kindle Unlimited or something like
Mm.
that, you'll be able to borrow it. But also, I'm trying to work with the Center for Restorative Justice, shout out to them in Pasadena locally,
Yeah.
to host a book club for the Parable series in July
Oh,
when it
cool.
starts. And we'll have online components. So if we decide to do that both in person and online, I'll send you the link.
Well, I can put it also in the show notes too. So if you have
Yeah.
a link to that, send me that and I'll put it in the show notes so the listeners can go and find it immediately without having to do any work of searching around for it.
Yeah, that'll
Okay.
be awesome. We'd love to have you.
So I love the fact that you are so deeply interested in this, very well-known author and these very well-known books, because what I feel like that does for you uniquely is it situates you as a really good person who can get out into the wider world, like just beyond being a college professor. You can
Yeah.
be involved in the world around you because literature is so ingrained in society and the history of society that I feel like you have a really nice entry point into being a part of the conversation by bringing these things in. Like, who wasn't like obsessed with the Handmaid's Tale series when that came out? Like, literature is all around us, you know what I mean? So I feel like you're uniquely situated for that. And I would love to hear your thoughts on getting out there as a public scholar and being involved in commentary about the world and being, visible and a part of the conversation for people beyond universities and colleges.
Yeah, I love this conversation because this is also a cornerstone part of my life as an educator. So, being out in the world beyond universities and colleges, first and foremost, it helps you to remember that universities and colleges are a part of a world. They're not a siloed, kind of hidden nature thing. You are getting people from a world and sending them to the world. And if you're not involved in the world that you're getting them from or sending them to, you gotta be really careful about the kinds of people that you're trying to create, right?
Hmm.
We don't live in an ivory tower. So creating ivory tower scholars don't help. I love being out in the world because there is so much brilliance. There's so much brilliance out there. So when I am talking to family members or friends, or I'm going and connecting with people who don't give a damn about religion, and they're like, why are we even having this conversation? And then we start talking, and they're like, oh, I hadn't thought of it that way. That is my favorite thing a person can say.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought of it that way because it opens them up to a different part of their imagination and they can begin to see, the red
Mm.
windows of the world, as it were. I also love the fact that I get to talk normally. No, like, academic speak.
Yeah.
Because I think at the end of the day, if we can't translate it into actual life, then what are we doing?
Right.
If my sisters or my mom or my dad or all of the different people don't understand what I'm saying, they don't have to be, I mean, they may not be interested in it, but at least they can understand the words that are coming out of my mouth, then what are
Sure.
we doing? And I understand that, the use of language and technical language is a sense of helping us to synthesize a bigger concept in one word. That's great. But if you can't break that down for people who are not in that field, it feels like I am then disconnected from the life in the world that I'm trying to create. And so
Yeah.
public scholarship is a way to keep you rooted in the kinds of worlds that your work is implicating in. And it's that
Mm.
bottom up, right? Like Corbin says. So it's this world. If I say something, it's going to change this world, not the ivory tower world, maybe, but it's a part of this world. So I need to be connected.
Yeah. Well, and everything you just said, that is my explicit goal for every single one of my guests, because I have guests that, have won Pulitzer Prizes and are like New York Times bestselling authors and are very, credible and reputable and well-known college professors. I want them to talk to me on this show as if my high school students were sitting in front of them. And I
Yes,
want it to be understandable for that. So that's my explicit goal with these conversations, is getting all of the things that all these professors know and talk about in their very researched books, and making it digestible in a way that any person can understand. That's my goal. So you and I, our goals are 100% aligned in that way.
absolutely.
What are some of the things that you are hoping to accomplish in public scholarship as you kind of, dive into this for the rest of your career?
Oh, yes. So this may sound really weird, but again, we're on a trajectory. So one of my current goals is to be the Miss Frizzle of theological education. And for those of you who don't know who Miss Frizzle is, because there are actually people who exist who don't know who Miss Frizzle
Yeah.
is, Miss Frizzle is a teacher in a magic school bus.
Yeah.
And part of the reason, also, side note, Miss Frizzle, Dr. Frizzle, does have a PhD. So let's put some respect in her name.
Yeah, no kidding.
The reason I say that is because there's something unique about the experiences that Miss Frizzle puts her students in, right? If they have questions about the body or if they have this, she doesn't go, okay, let's open your pages to some. She says, oh, you got questions about the body? Well, let's go. And they go into a body. And she is there with them, but she is asking them questions and they are naming the things. Oh, this is and this is where we are. And this is what happens when we do this. And when they get into, quote unquote trouble, they go, oh, well, the body does this. So there is this sense of learning and application in the real world in these really great magical ways that I think is just really brilliant. And so I would like to create the same experiences for my students. My number one rule in the classroom is you never forsake the brilliance in the room. Number one rule. But what that means is you are going to work in my class.
Hmm.
We're doing experiences, when we're engaging, you're going to work. So be prepared to start applying. When you're in this class, you're already a theologian, especially if I'm teaching an elective course. You're a theologian. We're going to be talking about Butler. We're going to be talking about this. You notice we're not reading a whole lot of theology. We're reading some theology, but I'm asking you what your tradition says about this. I'm asking you what your belief in God says about this,
Mm.
because you're going to work. So I combine this sense of experiential learning. I just taught an Afrofuturism class where we had the chance to go to the Smithsonian in DC, see the Afrofuturism exhibit. We went to an Afrofuturist restaurant. Shout out to Bronze in DC. If you haven't been, it's amazing. We got to see Afrofuturism actually happening in real life. And they got to contend with the context in which Afrofuturism is birthed, right? So they had to go and learn the history of African American culture and life. And then it was just questions and facilitating. So I do that regularly with different experiences. I do a lot of world building games in my class. Actually developing a class next August that incorporates theology and world building, where we'll be incorporating D&D. So it'll be a D&D campaign as
Cool.
we're thinking theologically about creating worlds and the implications of that. So again, I think part of my offer to theological education is this experiential learning piece and getting people to really think about how their theology, how their thoughts, how are the things that they're learning actually hit the ground, and what do
Mm.
they do when it gets messy? Because ultimately it does.
I know you're a little bit interested in podcasting as well.
Oh, yes.
Do you want to talk about some plans or some things like that? Do you want to blow the
Yes,
cover on any projects?
I would love to talk about a couple of upcoming projects. So the first project that I'm definitely going to do is was actually based off a conversation that I and Dr. Tomi Oradine, who's also a Sacred Rights alum,
She's amazing.
had. And every time, she would do something amazing, I would leave on the comment hashtag, why is she so dope? And so we would start going back and forth. And then in 2020, I decided to create space on my website for women of color who were incorporating spirituality into their work. It doesn't matter what kind of spirituality, it doesn't matter what kind of work. It was a nomination process just to create space to honor the women who were doing that work. And it was called Why Is She So Dope? In conversations with these women, they're like, it's really hard to just fill out a form and write about yourself. And I was like, so how can we get to know you? And they're like, I mean, we could talk about it. And I was like, you mean like a podcast? And they're like, I would totally do a podcast. And so we're going to be doing a podcast for Why Is She So Dope, which is for women of color who incorporate spirituality. I'm hoping to get all kinds of people on the podcast. We're at the ideation stages now because, of course, podcasts cost money, and that is part of why we haven't started yet. But we do have interviews lined up with some really great people, and so I'm hoping that by the end of the year, we'll have some interviews done. So that's the goal with that. I also just love doing interviews and podcasts and being a part of it. I was on a podcast called Why We're Friends a few years ago through Level Ground. You can find that on my website or anywhere that podcasts are available. I don't know if we're going to come back with the new season. We took a life break, but people are still asking. So we may revive the Why We're Friends podcast. I'm just, open
I
to
love
what's
it.
next. But yeah.
Fantastic. Well, how have you enjoyed the Sacred Rights program in general with your fall 2023 cohort?
Yeah, shout out to Sacred Rights. That was such a great experience. I wanted to join for a while, and when I had the time, I'm really glad that I did it. It really helped me to think through a lot of the practical things about public scholarship that people don't really talk about. Everybody thinks, oh, just go and write an op-ed, just go and write a blog, just go and write this. And depending on the content that you're engaging in and the way you want to to enter into that space, there are a lot of questions that I think people don't ask. And Sacred Rights was really great at proposing those questions and also helping us to answer those questions in really direct and practical ways. And it's also a great way to just connect with other people. I've met some amazing scholars and continue to meet amazing scholars in future cohorts. And it's a great space to possibly collaborate, learn about other things. And I'm always incorporating public scholarship into my classes. So to know somebody has done a podcast or something or this is a way that I can engage and teach my students how to engage with things in the real world, even things like Facebook posts.
Amazing. Well, Dr. Tamisha Tyler, I have been really enjoying your work, diving into your work. I know that we connected a while back about talking about how to plan a podcast, and that was such a great conversation. I'm so glad that we had the chance to connect before we ever recorded,
Yeah.
because I just love talking to you about your various interests and the fact that we get to talk about two things on this show, Theopoetics and Octavia Butler, that I've never talked about on the show. I love when brand new things get featured on the show. Where can people find you if they want to follow along with what you do and see where you go in the future?
Yeah, so I have a website, TamishaTyler.com. You can follow me there. It's a little outdated, but that's what happens when you have life. But we'll be adding some things this summer, so that'll be great. You can also find me on my socials if you just Google Tamisha Tyler, or I believe most of my socials are Tamisha Tyler, both on X, Facebook, and Instagram. I
Cool.
do have a TikTok. My TikTok is Theopoet.
Fantastic. Well, Dr. Tamisha Tyler, thank you so much for coming on Classical Ideas and hanging out. I have had an absolute blast today.
I as well. It was so great talking to you. Thanks for having me.